It's one of Canada's rock-solid calling cards around the world. More than half the world's mining companies are Canadian. But do they promote Canadian values when they do business abroad? Tonight, we take you on a journey to East Africa to uncover the story of a Canadian mine turning desert dirt into mineral riches. But to get at those riches, first the Canadians needed to get into business with a dictator.
He was a very charismatic, a very beguiling figure, but he was also showed these sort of real megalomaniac tendencies.
A Canadian company now partnered with a pariah state.
How do you feel about your involvement in a country that has been described as the North Korea of Africa?
We can control what we can control. As a company, we are bringing an awful lot of good to this country.
So, is the mine a force for good in a struggling country?
Absolutely. We're the template for responsible international business in that country.
Or is the money from that mine helping to prop up a brutal dictatorship? A dictatorship accused of doing business with terrorists.
Suicide bombings, murder of civilians, assassinations of foreigners.
I'm Mark Kelley in northern Ethiopia, and this is the Fifth Estate.
Sometimes the truth can hide in faraway places. That's why sometimes the truth is hard to find. We're trying to find it here, and what a place to look for it. The landscape in East Africa is rugged, the vistas revealing as we wind our way through the mountains. Life is stark and simple. It's all about survival. Barely a soul in sight, and yet every month, thousands of refugees leave Eritrea heading for camps in the region like this one. This is a safe haven for people who want to escape the grip of Eritrea's repressive regime, many of them just teenagers. Like this girl, she's just 15 years old.
I want to know, how did you leave Eritrea? How did you get here? Were you by yourself? Were you with family members? How long have you been here in this camp?
We're on the trail of two men who feel their lives are in danger because they're speaking out about what they say they endured working at a Canadian mine. Their names are on a lawsuit filed 12,000 kilometers away in the Supreme Court of British Columbia. The suit alleges beatings, torture, cruel and inhuman treatment at the hands of the government. So why would two guys living here be taking on a mining company based in Vancouver? Well, it's a twisted tale, and the answers, we hope, are somewhere in this camp. One of the first people we come across is Legesse Berhe, and sure enough, he tells us he worked at that Canadian mine. It's a bad memory for him. Berhe says he was forced to work day and night at the mine doing hard labor.
So would you work 7 days in a row all day?
He says forced labor is a daily reality in Eritrea, and that's why he and so many others have fled the country. Eritrea, a country of some 6 million people in the Horn of Africa. Its dry desert landscape looking more like a lunar moonscape. But beneath the surface, it's a land of mineral riches, a prospector's paradise. A world away in BC, there were whispers in the business community that Eritrea was a place where a mining company could strike it rich. Vancouver's Nevsun Resources was intrigued. Nevsun Vice President Todd Romaine.
We received a letter from a prospector about this amazing discovery in Eritrea. And our CEO at the time was very interested in exploring that, and he sent out to Nevsun officials in January in 1998. And it wasn't until 2003 that we discovered this monster of a deposit called the Bisha deposit.
Describe this monster to me. What was there?
Well, it was a giant layer cake with high grades, 5, 6, 7, 8% grades of gold, copper, and zinc. This giant ore body, which was again one of the highest grade deposits in the world.
But how could the Canadians tap into this monster mineral deposit? Eritrea was a broken country, bombed out and all but bankrupt after a 30-year war of independence with Ethiopia. Nevsun would have to start from scratch. And worse, the Horn of Africa is a dangerous place run by ruthless regimes. The US would call Eritrea's new leader an unhinged dictator. After winning Eritrea's independence in 1993, Isaias Afwerki, freedom fighter turned president, began a brutal clampdown against his critics.
He was a very charismatic, a very beguiling figure, but he was also showed these sort of real megalomaniac tendencies.
Journalist Michaela Wrong has written extensively about Eritrea.
The power remained with the military, the ruling party, and above all with Isaias himself. And what you see is, as the years go by, Isaias begins to sideline all his closest collaborators, the ones who really could have been a challenge.
Aaron Berhane was watching all of this unfold. He ran a newspaper in Eritrea, but after publishing stories critical of the government, he got a warning.
Two of those secret agents were waiting for me in the shade of the wall, and one of them, he put the gun on my ribs, and he said, if you write anything against this government from now on, this is going to be the last byline.
In 2001, the Eritrean president jailed political opponents and journalists. Berhane went into hiding. He would later dodge gunfire on the border and escape.
If I'm going to die, I have to die while I'm trying to flee, because I know what is going to happen. So if they arrest me, definitely they are going to torture me to death.
It was a dangerous climate, so the small mining company would have to take a big gamble. Should Nevsun stake its future in a place like Eritrea?
There are a lot of reasons why you wouldn't do business there, that the challenges would be insurmountable. Was there a period of deliberation whether you thought whether the risk was worth the reward?
Yeah, sure. We examined all those factors before we went into the country there, but we met with numerous government officials, senior levels of government there, and we were very encouraged by their openness to develop the mine in a responsible manner.
But running a mine in Eritrea would come at a cost. The dictatorship wanted in.
The state wanted 40% right off the bat, that they wanted to make sure that they were part of the board that made decisions, consensus style, and that they were benefactors of resource development.
Did you have any choice when they said, we want 40%? Was that a take it or leave it deal for you guys?
No, I think at the time it's just that this is what they wanted to do with their regulatory system.
But did you have a choice?
I don't recall the discussions back then, but I think if it meant stability for investment out there, I think we would have been favorable with those conditions.
It was a shotgun marriage. A small Vancouver company now in business with the regime of Isaias Afwerki in a country that didn't allow democracy or dissent. "13 years after first surveying the desert, Nevsun hit pay dirt. In February 2011, the gold started to flow, and so too did the money. In that first year of production alone, Nevsun reported revenues of $548 million. The company had now joined the club of Canadian mines making millions around the world.
Give me an idea of what success felt like for Nevsun in that time.
Well, I think a lot of people doubted our ability to operate in Eritrea, right? And I think as soon as it was able to come on board there, we were able to put a lot of our critics at bay, that we proved ourselves that we were able to operate in a far-flung jurisdiction like Eritrea and produce a world-class operation. If it wasn't for the support of the state, our partner, as well as all of our workers, it would not have been possible.
But while Nevsun was celebrating its success, troubling stories started to surface from the mine. When we come back,
There are no human rights violations on our mine site.
controversy dogs Nevsun's new business partner.
How do you feel about your involvement in a country that has been described as the North Korea of Africa?
For hundreds of years, foreigners have come to mine the mineral riches in Africa. But few ever ventured into this corner of East Africa, into a tiny country called Eritrea. But since 2011, that's where a Vancouver company called Nevsun has been turning desert dirt into zinc, copper, and gold. During its first 4 years in operation, the Bisha mine had generated profits of about $700 million US for Nevsun and its partner, the Eritrean government.
The Bisha mine, the first and only modern mine in the country, is playing a big part in helping create opportunity, prosperity, and self-reliance.
Nevsun's corporate video boasted about how well its workers are treated, a point of pride for the Canadian company, especially in a country ruled by a dictatorship.
Our employees are provided air-conditioned accommodations, most with private bathrooms, all equipped with TV and internet. All our workers and contractors receive free health care. Bisha's employees are served fresh and nutritious food free of charge, all they can eat, and much of it grown right here on our own farm.
How would the mine be used as a tool for this positive development, as you're calling it?
Well, I mean, just look at the mine since the beginning. We've contributed almost $2 billion to the Eritrean economy. $755 million has gone to the government, and that's gone to deal with poverty reduction, the building of community infrastructure, new hospitals, new schools. We provide well-paying jobs at the mine. So we believe we've made a very positive contribution to the ongoing economic development of the country.
That may well be, but remember, that country is run by a dictatorship that also had a 40% stake in running the mine. And some uncomfortable questions were being raised about the workers the government supplied to build the mine.
Indefinite national service for 20 years, paying $10 per month. That is a modern time slavery.
Elsa Chiram is an exiled Eritrean human rights activist. She's traveled the globe talking to former workers who fled the country, taking statements about their role in building the mine. She said many were forced into the job.
They did not apply for the job. Yeah, if they refused, they would be killed or tortured or detained indefinitely. So what choice do they have?
Chiram says the government was using military conscripts as a pool of cheap labor to build the mine. In Eritrea, everyone over 18 enlists in what's called the National Service, trained at camps like this. Some are used as soldiers, others are used as a labor pool for government projects. But did that include building the Bisha mine? Human rights groups considered this a modern form of slavery. Worse, in the case of the mine, they said it was forced labor for foreign profit. In January 2013, New York-based Human Rights Watch released a report called Hear No Evil, blaming Nevsun for failing to stop the use of forced labor at the mine. Nevsun insisted it didn't hire the workers. The company said they were provided by an Eritrean state-run company called Sagan Construction. Initially, Nevsun offered this apology. The company expresses regret if certain employees of Sagan were conscripts 4 years ago in the early part of the Bisha mine's construction phase. Nevsun was feeling the heat in Ottawa too. Some politicians felt doing business with a dictator would tarnish Canada's image abroad.
This is not true.
Nevsun CEO Cliff Davis was called on the carpet by a parliamentary committee.
How do you feel about your involvement in a country that has been described as the North Korea of Africa with respect to human rights violations?
We can control what we can control. As a company, we are bringing an awful lot of good to this country, and we are bringing an awful lot of good to the people of Eritrea.
But the controversy didn't die there. It only got bigger. Last year, the United Nations released a scathing 484-page report on human rights abuses in Eritrea, including the issue of forced labor to build the Canadian mine.
We are in the midst of a 4-day training course on human rights and the voluntary principles.
In response to the mounting public and political outcry, Nevsun had hired Montreal human rights lawyer Lloyd Lipset. He visited Eritrea 6 times to produce reports on Nevsun's operations.
Will you say now, with total certainty, that there is no forced labor being used in that mine?
With total certainty is a hard thing to say, but I am very confident that there's no forced labor, there is no national service used either in the direct workforce or in the Eritrean contractors that provide labor or transportation or security guards to the Bisha mine.
With Lipset's report in hand, Nevsun did a 180 on the issue. The company that once expressed regret that forced labor was used at the mine now says it has nothing to apologize for.
You don't believe that there was any conscripted labor that was ever used in the development or operation of your mine?
We've done extensive investigations to date inside Eritrea at the Bisha mine with former workers, both expatriates that have no tie to Eritrea, that don't work in Eritrea anymore, as well as people that still work there. And based on all this evidence, there's no corroborating claims to support any of the allegations being made.
There are a lot of allegations on the public record from people who say that they were conscripted labor working in your mine. Do you believe they're lying?
Let me read you something from, this is from the UN Commission of Inquiry report. It says here, testimonies collected by the Commission showed that some conscripts were used by Sagan to construct the underground network of tunnels for future mining operations. You know what the problem with that statement is, Mark? We're an open pit mine. There's never been tunnels. There was no tunnels in 2008, and there's no tunnels in 2016. You have to take these things with a grain of salt.
So the UN has got it wrong, or the UN is lying?
The UN had a very biased methodological approach, which only included testimonies from people outside the country. They did not want to meet with Nevsun to talk about all of our independent human rights impact assessments we've done in the country, or all the people that we've talked to. If they can get it so wrong with this tunnel analogy in an open pit mine, something so elementary, then, as I mentioned before, you have to take this with a grain of salt.
It's true, the UN didn't talk to anyone inside Eritrea. That's because the Eritrean government wouldn't allow the UN into the country.
Of course, we wanted to go to Eritrea and see the mine for ourselves and give the government an opportunity to answer to these explosive allegations. But in the end, this is as far as we got, northern Ethiopia. After months of back and forth with the Eritrean regime, we were told the Fifth Estate isn't welcome in Eritrea.
So, who to believe? Was forced labor used to build the Canadian mine? That's what we wanted to ask the 2 men who are suing Nevsun back in Canada. They're among the refugees trapped in northern Ethiopia. We have their names from the court documents. We catch a break when camp officials offer to run what little information we have through their records. The men are in the system, but are they still here? And will we be able to find them among the thousands of Eritrean refugees in this camp?
What can you do to help us find these guys? Because we've come a long way and we really need to help need his help to find these guys quickly because we're running out of time.
Yeah. We finally get a tip and set off to meet them.
Hi, I'm Mark. How are you? Canada. Nice to meet you. How are you?
His name is Kasete, and he's too nervous to allow us to record an interview, but he stands by his statement filed in a BC court. We couldn't independently verify his claims, but in his affidavit, Kasete says that although he was officially released from the military, he wasn't free. Kasete alleges that when he began working at the mine in 2008, he was effectively under the control of the Eritrean military. He says he could not refuse to work at the Bisha mine because he believed he would have been detained and punished severely. The second man from the lawsuit agrees to speak with us. His name is Mirtab, but he doesn't want to show his face on camera. We agree to conceal his face to protect his family in Eritrea.
How did you end up working at the mine? Did you have any choice about whether you wanted to work at the mine?
He says he was told by his superiors to hide the fact he was in the military when he was sent to work at the mine in 2010. According to his court statement, he worked in conditions of extreme heat. Malaria and diarrhea were common, and said conscripts collapsed while working. He also said he witnessed severe military punishment inflicted on conscripts for simply leaving the camp overnight.
Why are you too afraid to show your face on camera? What are you worried about? But you believe that somebody from Eritrea, somebody sent by the government would try to harm you or even kill you?
No.
Yes.
Their lawsuit claims Nevsun knew about the forced labor and cruel treatment and did nothing to stop it. Nevsun has denied this, leaving it to the BC Supreme Court to try to find out what really happened at that mine. When we come back, we investigate whether Nevsun's business partner was also in the business of financing terrorism. The Canadian mine in Eritrea isn't just the biggest one in that country, it's the only one. And to get into Eritrea, Vancouver's Nevsun Resources had to give the government a 40% stake in the mine. Revenues from the mine a lifeline for the cash-strapped Eritrean regime to the tune of $200 million US every year. But you don't have to travel far from Eritrea to find people concerned about what the regime is doing with its money. Even before the gold mine ever opened, Nevsun's business partner was seen as a bad neighbor for supporting rebel militia groups bent on destabilizing countries like Kenya.
We're just driving by Westgate Mall now. It was the site in 2013 of that terrible massacre of innocent civilians at the hands of al-Shabaab.
Late this afternoon, the Somali group al-Shabaab said it did this.
September 2013. Al-Shabaab gunmen murdered 67 and wounded 175 people in a terrorist attack on Westgate Mall in Nairobi. For years, Kenya has been the target of bloody and brutal terrorist attacks. So, what does that have to do with the Canadian mining company? Well, Nevsun was now doing business with the Eritrean government, a regime that was accused of sponsoring al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab leaves a trail of dead wherever the group strikes. It has allied itself with al-Qaeda, partners in a global jihad. Canadian Matt Bryden spent years investigating who was arming al-Shabaab on behalf of the UN Security Council. It didn't take long for his team to find evidence pointing to the Eritrean dictatorship.
They were supporting a group that was guilty of suicide bombings, murder of civilians, assassinations of foreigners. This was now clearly just a terrorist group.
The stakes were high, and not just for Africa. Even the Canadian government considers al-Shabaab a threat to global security.
Today we are subjected to unfair and illegitimate sanctions and baseless accusations.
At the UN, Eritrea's diplomats denounced the monitoring group's findings as biased and baseless. But were they? Was Nevsun's business partner also in business with terrorists? We traveled to the Eastleigh neighborhood in Nairobi to find out.
This is Mogadishu Street.
Home to 100,000 immigrants from Somalia and an alleged hotbed of support for the Somali-based al-Shabaab. We're here to find a former gun runner. His name is Abdinur Soyan. He says for 4 years his job for a militia group was to get weapons from the Eritrean regime and smuggle them to rebel groups in East Africa. The Eritrean government denies this.
So al-Shabaab, though, would have been armed with weapons that they got from Eritrea.
In 2011, with gold flowing from the Canadian mine and profits flowing into the pockets of Nevsun's partner, the Eritrean dictatorship, the UN was worried this new money could be diverted to al-Shabaab or other militia groups active in the region.
How was Eritrea paying for that? It's a poor country, doesn't have a lot of hard currency, very little in fact, at that time. So we looked at all of the potential sources and tried to understand how this was happening. Money was being spent, and there were only a limited number of places that Eritrea could have been coming up with these funds.
With the gold mine being one of them.
Gold mine being one of them.
So the UN asked for Nevsun's help. It wanted a forensic accounting of the money being transferred to the Eritrean regime, locations of the banks, account numbers.
We did reach out to Nevsun, and Nevsun's response, as best as I recollect, was to say that they were bound by confidentiality agreements with the Eritrean government and therefore couldn't provide us with any information, but assured us that none of the revenues were going into being used for military purposes.
Were you assured by that?
No, we weren't assured by that.
So why wasn't Nevsun more helpful with the UN's fight to stop the spread of terrorism in East Africa?
The concern of the UN wasn't that Nevsun was doing something wrong. The concern of the UN was that the Eritrean government was using the assets from your partnership in that mine to fund rebel groups, terrorist groups in that area of Africa. Was this a concern for you, that some of the assets from your mine and your partnership were being used to fund terrorist groups like al-Shabaab?
I can't comment on government policy. What I can say is that our company is fully transparent with all the monies that are generated from the Bisha mine. And we've had candid discussions with the Ministry of Finance about the need for them to be transparent.
Well, that's not how the UN sees it. In 2014, the Security Council Monitoring Group reported that Nevsun refused to disclose information on how payments were transmitted to the state of Eritrea, citing confidentiality agreements. Nevsun said questions should be directed to the state of Eritrea. But when the UN asked the Eritreans for banking information, they passed the buck right back to the Canadian mine, telling UN investigators they should direct specific questions to Nevsun.
But if this government were indeed financing a group that has been labeled by our own government, al-Shabaab, as a terrorist organization, this is your business partner. Wouldn't you be a little concerned about that?
Again, I can't comment on government policy.
But would you be concerned about that?
Again, we have evidence to support that the state of Eritrea is utilizing the money for beneficial things. The community of Adarat is receiving monies right now to build a pipeline system and water well, and that shows that the government of Eritrea is serious about utilizing the Bisha mine for positive constructive development in that country.
As for Abdinur Soyan, he says he's now out of the gun-running business, but he still looks over his shoulder every day. He says he's received death threats from the Eritrean regime for speaking out about al-Shabaab. The UN investigators have found evidence that Eritrea is now supporting other militia groups in the region, but not al-Shabaab. That's why the UN maintains an arms embargo against Eritrea to try to stop the spread of weapons, an embargo that Canada supports. When we come back, from business partner to partners in public relations. The plight of Eritreans rarely ever grabs the world's attention. That was until Europe's migrant crisis exploded into the news. Many of the people on these leaky boats on the Mediterranean are refugees from Eritrea. The UN estimates about 400,000 Eritreans have fled the country in recent years, escaping the dictatorship that has ruled the country since 1993. This is a country that desperately needs some good publicity. Enter Nevsun. It rolled out the top brass in a good news corporate video.
Well, the Bisha mine is the only producing mine in Eritrea, and it plays a very important role in the Eritrean economy, and we're proud to say it adds significant tangible benefits to the people of Eritrea.
The Bisha mine has been producing hundreds of millions of dollars in profits for shareholders and its partner, the Eritrean government.
We will try to make this as exciting as possible, as entertaining as possible, and as dangerous as possible.
Good, hands up.
All right, ready.
And both Eritrea and the Canadian company are proud to show off their success. This past November, the regime permitted a delegation of foreign diplomats to visit the Bisha mine.
These are two Canadians you guys will be seeing the next day. One, Mr. Lloyd Lipson, he's an international human rights lawyer. So he'll be talking about the human rights program at the Bisha mine. And then Mr. Kareem.
This is a high-powered group. That's Canada's new ambassador to Eritrea, Salah bin Daoud, sitting on the right in the light shirt. The U.S. ambassador is the one wearing the ball cap on the left. The Fifth Estate wanted to come along, but the Eritrean government wouldn't let us into the country. Nevsun, however, provided us with this home video of the trip. That's the U.S. ambassador dressed up in the local fashion, leading the cheer with Canada's ambassador. And there's the U.S. ambassador again, joining in a ceremonial dance. If there are ongoing human rights violations inside Eritrea, clearly this mission wasn't going to find them here. But then again, that wasn't their mission.
I'm very happy to be here with my colleagues from the South African Embassy, the German Embassy, the Canadian Embassy.
The group came to see the mine, and Canada's ambassador told us later in an interview he was impressed by what he saw.
Safir Canada. Safir Canada.
They are mining in I believe in a responsible way and protecting the environment, helping the neighboring communities.
We asked the ambassador if he requested to see any of the jailed journalists, political opponents, or prisoners of war who have been in prison for over a decade in Eritrea. The Canadian diplomat said, maybe next time.
Well, listen, I think for the next visit, certainly we will make a request to visit other things in the country. And I mean, it's up to the government to give us permits.
But if the diplomats weren't going to investigate allegations of abuse, the UN certainly was.
Now, a United Nations inquiry says Eritrea may have committed crimes against humanity.
We need freedom now! We need freedom now!
The UN released a 484-page report that made headlines around the world. It detailed human rights abuses in Eritrea, violations so serious they may constitute crimes against humanity.
Killings, torture, indefinite national service.
Eritrean activists demanded an end to the brutal dictatorship. Although the report was based on the testimony of some 700 Eritreans, Nevsun's vice president of corporate social responsibility said it wasn't credible.
But unfortunately, the United Nations methodology in this case was very biased and selective. It only included people from outside the country.
No, Nevsun won't let the UN's damning report distract them from what the company still insists is a good news story.
The Bishop mine is more than just a mine. It symbolizes a new path forward for the state of Eritrea. One where the state of Eritrea and a Canadian publicly traded company are working together, and they have developed a leading-edge mine, jobs and training for local people, robust environmental management, safety for all of our workers, consensus decision-making at the board level there, stakeholder inclusion. These are all aspects of core liberal democratic values, and we're very proud of our role in playing a positive role in the ongoing evolution of Eritrea.
But you're talking about the liberal democratic values you hope to bring to this country. And then the UN came out with its commission of inquiry, which talks, this is a country with very little respect for human rights, where they talk about extrajudicial killing, torture, systemic rights violations, forced labor, creating an alarming exodus of desperate people who are leaving this country now. Is this the liberal democracy you think that you're contributing to?
And I'll read the statement from Luis Maisel. He's a U.S. Chief of Mission. He was the U.S. representative that visited the Bishop mine a couple months ago. And here's what he said from his visit. He said, in summary, I saw a Western mining company that is creating jobs, investing in local people, mining responsibly, respecting human rights, acting as a good neighbor, and contributing to national development in Eritrea.
I'm talking about the government that you're in business with.
So we've had dignitaries and politicians around the world. You know why they're coming to the Bishop mine? Because we represent a new Eritrea, one that is embracing many liberal democratic values that I spoke about earlier. These people are very excited about it, and it's creating constructive, positive dialogue between the state and Western countries. And we believe we're playing a Canadian diplomatic role in making the situation much better.
Well, Nevsun's been working with the government of Eritrea for 16 years. We have a very positive relationship with the state.
After dealing with a dictator for almost 2 decades, Nevsun is sounding as much a booster as a business partner. Journalist Michaela Wrong says that's the key to doing business in Eritrea.
I don't think there's any option. If you're operating in Eritrea, you have to be on good terms with the government. It's not the kind of country where you can exert any independence. You know, you have to have good friends in government.
As for Elsa Chiram, the exiled Eritrean activist, will continue her fight to expose human rights abuses in that country. She accuses Nevsun of whitewashing a brutal regime.
If Eritrea was a democratic country and workers' rights was, respected and people were free, that's fine. It would have been a good force. But under the current regime, the current situation, human rights situation, Nevsun became accomplice to the crimes perpetrated against the Eritrean people.
And the Eritrean people continue their mass exodus. The country still bleeds refugees every day. Exiled Eritrean journalist Aaron Berhane.
The Eritrean flee their country because Eritrea is now a living hell.
They'd been dealing with a dictator too, and they'd seen enough. Putting their lives on the line to escape because they believe in something better. But Nevsun is staying put. The Vancouver company has expanded its mining operations in Eritrea, and it believes there's enough zinc and copper in the ground to keep making money at the mine until 2025.